From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
The idea of a cabal of elite business people conspiring to overthrow the government is like such red meat for like conspiracy theorists, and just like it's like sort of the quintessential thing everyone's scared about happening. But we've sort of talked on the show a lot about how like you almost don't even have to do that anymore, like to go to that extreme to organize in that way, because everything's sort of so set up for the success of these elite business people already, like the way our system has sort of evolved or devolved, I guess. Can you speak to that a little bit about what would a modern analog of this even look like, or is it something that people would even seek because business people at that level are already so set up and, government is already so in their pocket?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things, to look at the business plot in its own moment and then look at, there were other analogs in that era that I think, in some ways are closer to the things that are actually happening in this country now. Fascists never really came to power as I can't think of an example of fascists coming to power as a result of sort of, as you note, like an elite cabal, planning a secret takeover and then overthrowing the government. They tended to come to power through a combination of mass action and street violence, but also parliamentary action, right? So, Hitler becomes chancellor, essentially, prime minister of the Reichstag through democratic means. An alliance between the Nazis, who were the far right party, obviously in Germany at that time, and then also the slightly less extreme conservatives, who stupidly thought that they could control him, and they would just sort of like make him like this figurehead prime minister, and then everything would turn out okay. Mussolini comes to power in the 1920s. Again, this is sort of a preview of the plans, or this was part of where the business plotters, however many there were, we could talk about that, drew their inspiration. It was from an action in 1922 called the March on Rome, where basically, a bunch of just, fascisti thugs, came to Rome, the capital, and intimidated the government, and then convinced the king of Italy to appoint Mussolini as his prime minister, and appointed and convinced the parliament to approve it. The event that actually the business plotters were the one business plotter that we know was there, right, was this guy Gerald C. Maguire. He was like a 37-year-old bond salesman who's the guy who actually does the attempted recruiting of Smedley Butler. And he's the only one who actually gets called before Congress after, before the same subcommittee that Butler testified in front of. And he purges himself and lies about a whole lot of things, but in so doing, he essentially confirms all the salient points that Butler alleged against him. So we have him, and he says to Butler, according to Butler, that his inspiration. So he does this. Maguire takes this tour of Europe in early 1934, and he goes to all the hotspots. He goes to Italy, he goes to Germany, and he goes to France. And it's in France that he finds the model that he thinks is best suited to the American, culture. And he meets a group called the Croix de Feu, the Fiery Cross. And it's kind of like like a super militaristic version of the American Legion. Although the American Legion obviously was also doing sort of street actions and strike breaking and stuff like that. But this Croix de Feu was even more violent, and it's made up of French veterans of the last World War. And the reason why the Croix de Feu is important and an important model is that just a couple weeks before Maguire's in Paris, on February 6, 1934, another thing that people don't know about, there is a enormous anti-parliamentary riot in Paris consisting almost entirely of fascist and far-right groups and one group of revolutionary communists, because like they didn't want to miss out on it. And they storm Parliament. Tell me if any of this sounds familiar. It's kind of a loosely organized group of people that they're all sort of in the same direction, but they kind of all hate each other. And a bunch of them are just like a bunch of clowns. And they end up storming the legislature, and just end up fighting the police. Most of the people who die are the rioters themselves. About 15 of them, I think, are killed. But they terrify the French people because, their demand. And oh, by the way, they're also animated by a conspiracy theory. There was an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory because a prominent corrupt individual named Jeffrey Epstein, named Stavitsky, has just gotten rung up for corruption. And so they then build out this like huge, just ridiculous conspiracy theory that basically like everyone in the French government on the left, or basically left of the fascists,
like cannibal pedophiles.
Yeah, it's like they're corrupt and they're selling out the French people, and it's basically on the basis of this that they storm Parliament, and just as on January 6th, and by the way, it's even known by its date. It's called the 6 Février in French, so it's just known as February 6th. Still is, so on January 6th, on February 6th, they don't achieve their main aim, but they do succeed in, because it's a parliamentary system, getting and they're also trying to keep a government that's been elected from being seated. That's the last obvious parallel, right? And but they do succeed in having sort of the center left prime minister of France, who they say is, a communist, but he isn't. He's just like he's just
not a fascist.
He's just not a fascist. He resigns in favor of a conservative, and this ends up having long implications in French history. It's kind of the creation of what's known as the Popular Front, which was sort of a coalition between socialists and liberals to fight against fascism, but then it also helps coalesce what ends up becoming the Vichy collaborationist, government in France that takes power when the Nazis invade. What all of these things have in common, and what they have, what is different between them and the business plot, is that they are all examples of mass action that actually involves like a significant portion of a society. There needed to be a large number of people who believed in this shit and were willing to go into the streets and get into fights and draw blood, and shed their own blood, and just sort of, and then a larger number of people around them that was willing to, cheer and, write songs about them and all these other things. You need all of that really to see a fascist coup or a fascist government succeed. And there are a number of reasons why the business plot, such as it was, didn't succeed in overthrowing the government. I think the biggest one is that Smedley Butler, blew the whistle on it before it could go any further, assuming it would have gone any further. But one of the things that I think that did maybe was to discredit whatever was trying to happen, behind the scenes before, what would be known now like as an AstroTurf campaign, before sort of this messaging could get out, and create this kind of mass action. But also like the people who Butler alleges were behind it were people like, the DuPonts and like, the head of General Motors, and these were people who were maybe also sort of at JP Morgan, and company. These were people who were also maybe so sort of out of touch with the would-be rank and file, the working class, the people in the country who they would need to get behind them, that maybe they would have had a hard time doing it anyway. However, again, we'll talk about this, but however far the planning.
That's the question. So that's one of the spooky things that we keep going back and forth over. We know that the person who contacted Butler originally, we know that they were definitely attempting to proselytize. They were definitely like evangelizing, pitching him on how great this would be. But I love that you point out there are serious questions about how successful a coup d'etat would have actually been when the rubber of fascism hits the road, as it were. But this is one thing that I think is haunting about this situation. And I would love to hear you speak on this in a little more detail. My general understanding of what happens, Butler says, we have differing views on what constitutes patriotism. So he blows the whistle. Congress hears him out. He does testify to Congress. And, Congress does listen to him at least. But then there's a moment where Congress just sort of doesn't do shit, right? If I could use the technical legislative term here, they just don't. So what that missing part, right? The fact that they did not move forward on there is why folks like you and us have to carefully deploy the word allegedly in a lot of these conversations. So I would love to hear your, because you are the foremost expert on this now. So I would love to hear your concepts or your perspective on why those investigations never occurred. Like, why was there never like a hard hitting dive into DuPont? Exactly. Why was that?
So the committee that Butler testifies in front of is a subcommittee, but it's the leaders of this larger committee. It's called the Select Committee on Un-American Activities. And if, my fellow history nerds out there those words might ring a bell. This is what becomes ultimately HUAC, which is one of the most notorious committees in American history. It is associated with the McCarthy era. Obviously, Joseph McCarthy was a senator, so he wasn't on HUAC, but they were engaging in that same kind of sort of red baiting, wish hunting of suspected communists after the Second World War, during the Cold War and the Second Red Scare. So that committee was primarily engaged in, they had been convened to investigate, it was called like Nazi propaganda and other activities. They were interested in attempts by the actual Nazis, right? The German National Socialist Workers' Party to infiltrate the United States, which was happening. I mean, there were American groups. The Silver Shirts were one. The German American Bund was another. That was taking direct money and direct funding from the Nazis, and there were Americans who were working with the Nazis, right? So Henry Ford is one of the most famous. He ends up accepting like the Grand Cross of the German Eagle in 1938, which is like, there's no good time to be hanging out with Nazis, but like that's late. That is extremely late, Mr. Ford. Another name, by the way, that often comes up popularly with the business plot, but as far as I can tell, was not actually involved. This is sort of the result of miscommunication. Is Prescott Bush, right? Who was the grandfather of George W. Bush and the father of George H.W. Bush. So two presidents. He becomes a senator himself later. The reason why that confusion occurs is because the same committee that Butler testified in front of was investigating in a separate investigation the bank that Bush was a partner of, Brown Brothers Harriman, because Brown Brothers Harriman was doing business with the Nazis, and they had this sort of joint ownership thing over a shipping line. But so it's actually it's kind of not true, but it's like Bush was too close to the actual Nazis to actually be involved with the business plot, because the business plot was an entirely homegrown affair. So to a certain extent, maybe that's part of the explanation of why.
Can I jump in really fast,
Yeah.
John? I just want to apologize to everyone listening. I have asserted a couple of times that Prescott Bush was a part of it. I just misunderstood. So I do apologize there. Wow. He was too busy in Nicaragua, I guess, with the Brown.
Exactly. Yeah. It's an easy mistake to make. And if anybody out there has, information that is different than this, like, I would love to hear it. I'm always open to corrections and trying to be as complete as possible. But so far as I can tell, that came into the conversation. There was a BBC documentary in 2007 that sort of ran through that very quickly. And there was like a blog post that got written that made that confusion. And that's what, and it was, Bush was president at the time. So it kind of caught fire, and here we are. But anyway, and that's the kind of rigor that I try anyway. What was I going to say? So that's part of it. The other thing is that, this committee, it had a limited shelf life. It was supposed to disband a couple of weeks after Butler testified, and it did on schedule. Now, it seems like to me, who am I? A million years later, it would have been like, you could have easily made the case to like go back to the Speaker of the House and say, like, we have this actual like important thing going on, maybe we should extend the life of this committee for a little while. They did not. It seems like, so Butler there are two main members of the committee, John McCormack, who ends up becoming Speaker of the House years later. He ends up serving until the 1970s. And Samuel Dickstein, who's a Democrat of New York. They're the two people who really wanted to form this committee, and they're the two people who hear Butler's testimony under oath in a special session in New York. And Butler spends a significant portion of 1935 fighting on the radio. Basically, he's like in a poster like flame war with Samuel Dickstein, where Butler has this like radio show, sponsored by Pep Boys, by the way, because he's in Philly, where he's using his like Pep Boys radio hour to be like, these assholes aren't, like, I gave them this thing and they're not investigating it. They brought the lowest level people forward. Why aren't they going to bring the higher level people?
And he sort of mocked a little bit, wasn't he? Like, even publicly,
yes.
He was ashamed to some degree.
Yes. So that's another part of it, right? The initial reaction by the press to Butler's testimony is ridicule. I mean, he gets the New York Times runs the story of him testifying on the front page, but they give most of the real estate to the denials of the people who Butler implicated. He's mocked in Time magazine. He's mocked in a Times editorial. It's later on, there are like very small walkbacks, corrections, when McCormack and Dickstein, when their committee like issues its final report in 1935, and they're basically like, we were able to verify, the pertinent parts of Butler's testimony as far as they went. These things, I forget the exact wording, it's in Gangsters, but like, it's like, these things were definitely discussed, and they may have been put into action, when the backers saw fit, but they did not bring the big guys in. And I think it was probably fear of, these are very powerful people, the DuPonts, J.P. Morgan, his bank, Alfred P. Sloan of General Motors, McCann Erickson ad agency. These were very, very powerful, very influential people. Butler accused. So Butler testifies that Jerry Maguire approached him. Jerry Maguire is brought in to testify, as I said, through a perjury-filled, ridiculous testimony. He ends up sort of accidentally confirming most of what Butler said. One of the low-level people who sort of seemed to be backing Maguire early on is a guy named he's the heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune. Say that for. Should I boop again? The Singer sewing machine fortune. And his lawyer comes in and basically throws Maguire under the bus. And it's just sort of like, no, it was all him. It was all him. So one of the reasons why I think, maybe more than some other people do, that Maguire, that it is credible that Maguire actually had some people behind him, is Maguire's boss, a guy named Grayson Mallet Provost Murphy. He was a rich financier who had the resume of someone who would have known how to plan a coup. So he's Butler's age. He joins the military during the Spanish-American War, but goes into military intelligence and spends a couple of decades going around the world to a lot of the places that Butler went, but as a spy. And he works in the Philippines. He seems to be part of the plot to sever Panama from Colombia, which the Marines participate in, which is what enables the United States to build the Panama Canal and establish the U.S. Canal Zone. He then goes into private finance. His uncle is the guy who actually calls Brown Brothers, speaking of Prescott Bush, and tells them, you should come into Nicaragua and take over the banks, and we can get the Marines behind you. He tours Europe after World War I. He's in Europe helping run the American Red Cross during the First World War. And then he tours Europe after the war with Wild Bill Donovan, who ends up becoming the spy master head of what's known as the OSS, which is, the immediate forerunner to the CIA. So this is a guy who would have known Butler very well, not necessarily personally, but he would have known his career. Mm-hmm. And he certainly, as I say in Gangsters, would have known his way around the planning of a coup. That is Jerry Maguire's boss.
I just want to pause for a moment and point this out, although it's extraordinarily petty. When we hear these kind of stories, Jonathan, with this massive connections and evidence and people getting away, I am yet again flabbergasted. Like, I can't even get out of a late fee at the library. You know what I mean? Where's the justice?